welcome to episode 5 of the Whiskey Jug. I'm your host Schwa, and today we're talking about American whiskey. Now, this is the last video in the Whiskey 101 series that we're doing here. After this, we're going to get back into we're going to get into what is going to be the normal kind of status of the Whiskey Jug, which will be reviews, recipes, interviews with distillers and tours when we can get them, and that sort of thing. Now, one of the nice things about American whiskey, when you compare it to something like, say, Canadian whiskey, is that the label, you can learn a lot about the American whiskeys. By American law, if it's a named alcohol or a named grain, then, like rye or corn, then the mash that makes it up has to be at least 51% of that named variety, such as, rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye in the mash. Corn whiskey, at least 51% corn. Wheat, malted rye, oat, whatever it is, has to be at least 51%. And bourbon is corn. It's 51% corn in the mash. So you can tell a lot based on the label just on that. The next up is in America, if it's been aged for at least 2 years in new charred oak barrels, you can get the designation of straight, which if you've ever looked at a bottle of Jim Beam, you'll see where it says, in very big letters, Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. You can tell that it was made in Kentucky, obviously. It's a straight bourbon whiskey, so it's been aged for at least 2 years in a charred oak barrel, and it's a bourbon whiskey, so the mash is at least 51% corn. And another thing about any of the named varieties is that they can't be any more than 80% alcohol. That does change when you get into some of the blended, but for the straight varieties, which in my opinion are where you get the best flavor, there can't be above that. Now, when it comes to American blended whiskeys, it does tend to get a little bit dicier than in some other areas. Americans we can't seem to get away from artificial stuff. Blended whiskeys like, say, Seagram's here, the American whiskey, a blend of distinctive character. Any of these blends, they take a blend of straight whiskeys, they take a blend of unaged whiskeys, and they take a big dose of grain-neutral spirits, which does have to be displayed on the label. So if you obviously won't be able to see it, but if you look on the side, they'll somewhere on the bottle say like 75% grain spirits. A lot of times they also get additional flavoring and coloring, so not even whiskey escapes the additives in America. Now, grain-neutral spirits, if you're not familiar with that is, a grain-neutral spirit is pure grain alcohol, and the term neutral comes from the fact that it has no flavor from the mash that creates it. And any distilled spirit of 170 proof plus with no flavoring is a neutral alcohol. They reach 190 proof max. One of the most popular and one of the most famous or infamous pure grain alcohols is Everclear. That is a grain alcohol. And you've probably seen it in your grandpa's woodshed or at the top of some shelf in the liquor store. It's selling for really cheap, and that's because it is. And that's what makes up most of the blended whiskey. Like I said, in this case, 75%, and the rest of it is some sort of mash of straight and unaged, and then whatever flavorings and colorings and whatever you want. So blended American whiskeys, kind of the low rung in as far as I'm concerned, and for good reason. It's mostly not whiskey. Now, one of the things to point out, and something that people have often wondered about when I have spoken to them, is what's the difference between a Tennessee whiskey and a bourbon? And what's the thing that makes them different? Well, the main thing that makes them different is that Tennessee whiskey, once it finishes out through the process, it gets filtered through a sugar maple charcoal, which removes some of the impurities It gives that another filtering right before the end, adds it just a hint of sweetness. That's really it. Other than that, it's a 51% corn mash, and the process and everything to making it is the exact same as bourbon. And that's really the big difference between them. Now, when you're looking for American whiskeys, in my opinion, the best is rye whiskey, and I'm actually not the only one that says that. In the 2010 Whiskey Bible, so this year's edition, Jim has given the Sazerac 18 year the Whiskey of the Year, which rye whiskey was one of the first American whiskeys and really kind of the signature American whiskey that for a long time just kind of hung around the underground. It was really big during Prohibition, and it was even rumored that Al Capone had rye whiskey smuggled into him while he was in prison. And so rye whiskey really is one of the more signature American whiskeys to come along, and it's good to see it coming back. One of the premier, in my opinion, and I think that they'll be able to overtake Sazerac within the next little while, is High West. They're actually here in Utah, in Park City, and that is my favorite rye whiskey. I haven't had the Sazerac 18, so I can't really speak to that effect, but it is fantastic. So if you see a bottle of this, and they are available in several states outside of Utah, give it a try. Now when it comes to bourbon, you've got a lot of range. You got the Eagle single barrel. You've got the Booker's, which is fantastic if you can pick it up, and I believe it's a Jim Beam, if I remember right. Yeah, and utterly delicious. It's also very powerful. It's a 63.545%, so it's got a good kick to it. Bullet is a great bourbon. Wild Turkey, which has been made infamous by your granddad and Hunter S. Thompson. This was his drink of choice, is another example of bourbon, Maker's Mark. Now when it comes to corn whiskey, one thing, it's a little bit harder to find. You don't find as much. In Utah you only have one variety, and it's really, really sweet compared to the rest. Another thing to note about American whiskey is that it really is responsible for NASCAR. Yeah, let that sink in next time you're kicking back a nice glass of your favorite American whiskey. Back in Prohibition times, when the moonshiners and bootleggers needed to get whiskey from, and other alcohol, but a lot of it was whiskey from one location to another, they needed to employ people who had fast cars and could drive, etc. And as Prohibition was coming to an end, stock car racing was just barely starting out, and so you had all these bootleggers, and the bootleggers had more money, they had the best cars, they had the best drivers, and they had the best mechanics. And so when they went into the stock car racing, they really began to clean up, and they found it as a good outlet for their driving skills, and from there it just kept growing, and they were the ones that had the money to keep it moving. So NASCAR really does get its roots back in from bootlegging whiskey. So whiskey's responsible for that. So give that a thought next time. That's it for American whiskey. Hope you had fun, and till up next episode, cheers.